Imagine you're standing at the plate, eyes locked on the pitcher. He winds up, and suddenly 5 ounces of stitched red leather are screaming toward your temple at 90 miles an hour. In that split second, there is no time for thinking. If your brain had to wait to charge up, gathering energy, and deciding to send a signal from scratch, you'd be on the ground before your synapses even blinked. I've spent years watching students sit in introductory psychology lectures, staring blankly at diagrams of what look like purple hot dog buns and complex mathematical equations, trying to grasp how a thought actually moves. They often approach the brain like a computer that's waiting for a command to power on. Yeah. But the reality is far more tense and honestly a little bit strange. Think about a toilet handle held at the very edge of a flush, or a spring compressed to its absolute limit, vibrating with the urge to snap. Right now, as you read this, billions of your neurons are in a state of leaky anticipation. They aren't sitting idle. They are actively maintaining a negative electrical charge, intentionally leaking potassium like a boat taking on water just to stay at a precise vibrating tension of negative 70 millivolts. We usually think of a leaking battery as a broken one, but in your head, that leak is the only thing keeping you alive. It's a state of potential energy that allows your nervous system to be permanently hair-triggered. The all-or-nothing explosion that follows, the action potential, isn't about the brain creating energy. It's about what happens when the neuron finally stops holding itself back. Most textbooks get bogged down in the how, but they miss the why. Why is your brain fundamentally, at its resting core, a little bit negative? And why is the fact that your cells are leaking the very reason you're fast enough to duck that baseball? To understand the flash of human behavior, you first have to understand the silent electrical pressure that builds before the flash ever happens.
That is just the perfect way to frame this. That whole idea of being on the verge of action, not being off, is really the core of what we're getting into today.
Right.
We are doing a deep dive into, well, the evolutionary need for this state and the unbelievable metabolic cost of keeping a nervous system perched right on that knife's edge.
It's a story full of paradoxes, it seems.
It really is. I mean, it completely reframes what rest even means for the brain.
We're not resting, we're ready.
Exactly. And the whole discussion today is really framed around two sort of fundamental tensions in how neurons are built.
Okay.
So the first is what we can call the tension of maintenance. This is all about the staggering amount of energy it takes just to hold the neuron at that negative 70 millivolts.
Just to do nothing.
Just to sit there ready. It really forces you to ask, why would a system evolve to have a constant passive leak of ions? It seems so inefficient. But that leak is the entire reason we have that readiness.
So it's an intentional inefficiency. The body is literally throwing energy away just to keep the system primed.
Precisely. It is inefficiency that's been engineered for survival. And that leads to the second tension, which is the tension of transmission.
So this is when the neuron actually fires.
Right. When it finally decides to send the message, it faces a choice. And there's this fundamental trade-off between the fast, powerful, what you could call digital signal, the action potential.
The big spike.
The big spike, yeah. That's great for long distances.
Yeah.
But it's in tension with the much more subtle, high-information analog signal, the graded potential, which is used for these very local conversations between neurons.
So the brain has to choose. It can shout reliably over a long distance, or it can whisper with a lot of detail up close.
Exactly. And we're going to see that in choosing to shout, it sacrifices an incredible amount of information and, metabolic efficiency. It's a constant battle between speed and data.
Okay, so let's start with that cost, the cost of just being ready. When we say negative 70 millivolts, we're really talking about potential energy, right? So why did evolution decide that this actively negative, constantly maintained state should be the default?
In a word, speed. It's all about latency and survival. That negative 70 millivolt resting potential is stored energy. It's a compressed spring ready to go.
So the neuron doesn't have to, charge up its battery before sending a signal.
Not at all. The energy is already there, stored in those separated ions. When the moment comes, it can fire instantly. There's no delay.
And that instant readiness, that is the evolutionary inheritance we're talking about.
It absolutely is. I mean, think about it from a threat response perspective, because that's really what honed our nervous system. There's this great illustrative anecdote about a field researcher, Elias, tracking mountain lions.
Right.
He stumbles upon a cougar just 20 feet away. And in that split second, before his brain has even consciously processed danger, before he's decided to run or freeze, his body is already flooded with the potential for action.
The action hasn't happened, but the system is already at 100%.
His neurons were already primed. That state of high-tension readiness is what allows for immediate adaptive response latency. That's why you can duck a baseball. It's a physiological gift from millions of years of ancestors who survived because their nervous systems were always conked and ready.
Any hesitation, even 100 milliseconds, and they wouldn't be our ancestors.
And they wouldn't. So that frames the resting state not as this passive default setting, but as an incredibly expensive active holding pattern.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that. If we zoom in on the neuron's membrane, why is it negative on the inside compared to the outside? And we should probably remember that the whole system, the fluid inside and outside the cell, is electrically neutral overall.
That's a really crucial point. It's a common point of confusion. The bulk fluid on either side is neutral. The charge difference, that -70, it only exists right across the very thin surface of the membrane. It's a tiny, tiny layer of separated charge.
And the main reason for that separation is this leak.
Precisely. The number one cause is that the membrane is selectively permeable. Evolution has designed it to be really leaky, specifically to potassium ions, K+.
I mean, we have a ton of potassium inside the cell just wanting to get out.
A ton of it. The concentration is about 20 times higher inside than outside. So these positive potassium ions are just itching to diffuse out down that steep concentration gradient.
And as the positive charge leaves, what's left behind?
The big negatively charged proteins and other molecules that are trapped inside, they can't follow the potassium out. So as positive K+ leaks out, the inside of the cell just gets more and more negative relative to the outside.
And that growing negative charge starts pulling the positive potassium back in.
Exactly. The leak continues until that negative electrical force inside becomes strong enough to perfectly balance the outward chemical force of the concentration gradient.
So the cell settles at the precise point where the push and the pull are equal. And that equilibrium point is our -70 to -75 millivolts.
That's the beautiful, delicate balance. But this is where the tension, that first tension of maintenance, becomes really acute. If potassium's always leaking out, and we also know that some sodium is always leaking in,
And eventually everything should just even out, right? The battery would go dead.
the whole system would collapse to zero, the gradients would disappear, and that's why we need what you call the invisible Sisyphus, the sodium-potassium pump.
We really need to appreciate just how much work this little machine does.
It is the relentless laborer of the nervous system. I mean, our entire consciousness, our ability to react, it would all just stop without the constant work of this pump fighting against entropy.
So what's its job mechanically? How does it fight the leak?
It's constantly pushing ions back to where they came from against their concentration gradients. It's an active process, so it burns ATP, our body's energy currency, and the ratio is always the same.
Right, the 3-to-2 ratio.
3 sodium ions get forced out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions it brings in.
Okay, so 3 positive charges out, only 2 positive charges in. That's a net loss of 1 positive charge each time. So that contributes to the negative interior.
It does, and that's the common misconception. That's where people think the resting potential comes from. But the pump's direct contribution from that one net charge, it's surprisingly small.
How small?
We're talking about maybe -4 millivolts. Of the total -70, the vast majority of the resting potential comes from that passive potassium leak we talked about.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying the single most energy-hungry component in the entire nervous system only directly creates about 4 millivolts of charge? That seems insane. Why spend a third of our food on something with such a tiny direct electrical payoff?
Because its indirect effect is absolutely everything. The pump isn't primarily an electrical generator. It's a custodian of the concentration gradients.
It's not making the voltage, it's making the potential for voltage possible.
Exactly. Its main job is to maintain those steep differences. 10 times more sodium outside, 20 times more potassium inside. Without the pump constantly resetting those piles of ions, the gradients would flatten out.
The cell would become non-excitable.
Completely. No resting potential, no action potential, nothing. The pump maintains the reservoirs that the leak and the spike can then draw upon.
And this endless maintenance work is why the nervous system has such a, frankly, terrifying metabolic cost.
It is terrifying. The energy use is just immense. I mean, current estimates are that nearly a third of all the ATP you generate from the food you eat every single day
A third.
goes to fueling these microscopic sodium-potassium pumps. A third of your daily calories are spent just maintaining the potential for your brain to act, not even the action itself.
That's just humbling. Our entire ability to think and react is propped up by this invisible engine burning through our resources just to keep us balanced on that razor's edge.
So now that we've established that incredibly expensive state of readiness, let's talk about the moment of commitment, the moment the neuron actually fires.
This is where we go from those subtle analog whispers to the big digital shout.
Yes, exactly. We're moving from the graded potential to the all-or-nothing action potential. The initial signal, the input, it starts as these small, flickering, graded potentials in the dendrites and the cell body.
And these are linear, right? A bigger input gives a bigger flicker, but they fade out pretty quickly.
They do. They decay over distance. They're like ripples in a pond. They're just adding up, integrating all the incoming information.
Building up pressure, like water behind a dam.
That's the perfect analogy. And the moment that pressure, that voltage, reaches the top of the dam, the threshold of excitation, which is usually around -50 or 60 millivolts.
Their dam breaks.
The dam breaks. The neuron fires an action potential. And it is absolutely an all or none event. It either happens completely, at full strength, or it doesn't happen at all.
And this action potential is purely an event that happens along the axon. It's not in the dendrites. And it travels the whole length of that axon without losing any strength.
And it is unbelievably fast. The entire electrical storm at any one point on the axon is over in about 1 millisecond. It's just an incredibly rapid sequence of gates opening and closing.
Okay, let's break down that millisecond. What kicks off that huge sudden rush of positive charge into the cell?
So that first phase is depolarization, the spike. As soon as the membrane hits that threshold voltage, specialized voltage-sensitive sodium channels just snap open.
And all that sodium that the pump worked so hard to push outside is just waiting.
It's waiting. And the forces pulling it in are enormous. You have the huge concentration gradient pushing it in, and you have the negative electrical charge inside pulling it in. So sodium ions just flood into the cell.
And that flips the charge inside from negative to positive.
Way positive. It can peak at like plus 40 millivolts sometimes.
Yeah.
That's the very tip of the spike.
Okay, and then just as quickly, the system has to slam on the brakes and reset.
Right. This is repolarization. So first, those sodium channels quickly slam shut and inactivate. That stops the positive influx. And then, crucially, a different set of channels, the delayed potassium channels, open up.
And now the inside is positive, so the positive potassium wants out.
It rushes out, driven by both the electrical repulsion and its own concentration gradient. This flood of positive charge leaving the cell is what brings the membrane potential crashing back down to a negative value.
And it often overshoots a little bit, right? Goes even more negative than resting for a moment.
It does. That's called hyperpolarization. Those potassium channels are a little slow to close, so it briefly dips below -70. And that creates a refractory period where it's harder to fire again immediately.
Now, wait a second. You're saying the pump isn't involved in this immediate reset at all? It's all just the channels opening and closing? That feels wrong, given how much energy the pump uses.
It's a critical distinction to make. The rapid rise and fall of the action potential is purely the work of those fast, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. The pump is just too slow. It's working away in the background, yes, but its job is to restore the long-term concentration gradients over time, not to shape the millisecond spike itself.
It's the cleanup crew, not the main actor.
Exactly. It makes sure the reservoirs are full for the next 1,000 spikes.
So speaking of those reservoirs, if sodium is rushing in and potassium is rushing out with every spike, doesn't that deplete the gradients pretty quickly?
You would think so, but the number of ions that actually move is astonishingly small.
Really?
For any single action potential, the change in the overall concentration of ions is less than 1/10,000%. It's incredibly efficient in that regard. A neuron can fire thousands and thousands of times before the gradients would run down in any meaningful way.
Wow. So we have this self-contained, incredibly fast electrical event. How does that wave actually travel down a long nerve, say, from my brain to my foot?
It moves like a falling line of dominoes. The big rush of positive sodium at one spot on the axon passively raises the voltage of the little patch of membrane right next to it.
And that pushes the next patch to its threshold.
Which causes its sodium channels to snap open, regenerating the full spike right there. And that process just repeats itself, this wave of regeneration, all the way down the axon.
But for long nerves in humans, we have a turbo boost. We have the myelin sheath, the purple hot dog buns from the textbooks.
Yes, the myelin is absolutely essential for fast, long-distance signaling in big animals like us. It's a fatty insulator wrapped around the axon.
And it prevents the current from just leaking out.
Right. Critically, there are no channels under the myelin. The action potential can't be regenerated there. It only gets regenerated in those little unmyelinated gaps between the myelin segments.
The nodes of Ranvier.
The nodes of Ranvier. And this structure allows the signal to skip from node to node.
So it doesn't have to do the slow domino fall thing along the whole length?
Correct. This is called saltatory conduction, from the Latin word for to leap. The electrical signal travels passively and very quickly under the insulated myelin, and then it gets a full-strength boost at each node. This makes myelinated neurons up to 10 times faster than unmyelinated ones.
And we experience the difference between those speeds every day. The classic example is stubbing your toe.
It's the perfect illustration. You feel two distinct things, separated by a noticeable delay. The first thing you register is the impact, the touch.
Which arrives almost instantly.
Instantly. That signal travels on huge, heavily myelinated beta fibers at maybe 100 meters per second. Your brain knows what just happened the moment it did.
But that deep, throbbing ache, that comes later.
That comes later because that dull pain signal travels on tiny, often unmyelinated C fibers. They have to do the slow, continuous regeneration all the way up your leg. That signal might only be moving at 1 meter per second, so your brain gets the impact report, and then a second or two later, the pain report finally arrives. Your whole experience of that injury is dictated by the insulation on the wires.
Okay, so the action potential, this all-or-nothing digital spike, it's the brain's solution for speed and reliability over distance. But as we hinted at earlier, this comes at a really steep price. A huge drop in both energy efficiency and, maybe more surprisingly, information density.
This is where we get into the information theory side of things, and the numbers are just startling. There's a clear twofold penalty that comes with using action potentials. Basically, the analog graded potentials, the little whispers, are just fundamentally better at carrying rich, detailed information than the digital spikes.
And the conversion from analog to digital, it kills the efficiency.
It kills it. You lose well over 90% of the efficiency in the process.
90%? I mean, if the brain is an information processor, that just seems like a catastrophic loss. Why would it ever choose a system that throws away that much data?
It's a necessary compromise, really. Those analog signals, they're rich with data, but they fade out. They're noisy. They're completely useless for sending a reliable message from your toe to your brain.
So the digital spike, because it's all or nothing and it regenerates, it guarantees the message arrives intact.
It arrives reliably, but the cost is that the message itself is much, much simpler. You have a massive drop in the information rate and a huge increase in the energy cost.
Let's focus on that data loss first. Just how much information are we giving up when we standardize a rich analog signal into a simple train of spikes?
It's almost an order of magnitude less. Some of the modeling studies are really clear on this. They simulate how much information a neuron can actually transmit per second, and the non-spiking neurons that use graded signals are just way better.
Okay, so what are the numbers?
Well, in these models, the graded potential neurons could reach information rates up to about 2,240 bits per second. That's a huge amount of continuous data flowing through.
2240, that's a lot. And the spiking neuron?
The equivalent spiking neuron model, it maxed out at about 235 bits per second.
Wow. So you're losing almost 90% of your data throughput just by choosing to spike.
You are. You're throwing away all the nuance, all the subtlety of the continuous signal in favor of a simple series of yes or no pulses.
Why is the spike such a poor information carrier, fundamentally?
Because it's a discrete event. Spikes have a set shape and a finite duration. They have much lower, what's called signal entropy. You lose the ability to code for all those little in-between voltage values, the maybe signals, the almost signals. They all just get filtered out.
And what's really fascinating is that this information loss starts happening before the spike even fires. The very machinery that makes spiking possible actually messes with the quality of the incoming analog signal.
Exactly right. Just having the voltage-gated channels there, ready to go, introduces at least 3 problems that degrade the signal before it even gets a chance to cross the threshold.
Okay, let's go through those. What's the first problem?
First, you get more intrinsic noise. Those voltage-gated sodium channels, they're not perfect switches. They flicker open and closed based on probability, and that adds a lot of electrical noise to the baseline voltage. That noise just drowns out the really subtle, low-amplitude information in the original signal.
So the very thing that gives the neuron its firepower also makes its sensors noisy.
Yep. Second, you introduce nonlinearities. As the voltage gets closer and closer to the firing threshold, those channels start to partially activate, and that partial activation distorts the signal. The relationship between the input and the voltage change is no longer a straight line, which makes it harder to reconstruct the original subtle information.
It's like turning up the gain on an old amplifier. You get louder, but you also get a ton of static and distortion right before the sound really kicks in.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And the third issue is probably the most obvious one, the action potential footprint.
Right. The spike itself takes time.
It does. The spike and the recovery period after it, the hyperpolarization, can last for around 6 milliseconds. And for that entire time, the neuron is effectively deaf. It's completely oblivious to any new information coming in.
So for 6 milliseconds, any new input is just gone, wasted.
It's completely lost in the noise of its own internal electrical storm. And this problem gets worse and worse the faster the neuron fires, which is probably why the brain seems to favor sparse codes firing less often to minimize that blind time.
Okay, so you have this system that's inherently noisy, distorts the input, and periodically goes deaf. And the end result is a signal that carries 10 times less information.
And that leads us straight into the energy efficiency crisis. It's not just information poor, it's metabolically obscene.
Let's quantify that. If we're comparing the 2240 bits per second analog signal to the 235 bits per second spike, what's the difference in the energy bill?
It's another order of magnitude difference. Spiking consumes a tremendous amount more ATP per second for the same stimulus. But the really shocking comparison is when you measure efficiency in terms of bits per ATP molecule.
So how much information do you get for your energy dollar?
Exactly. And on that metric, the graded potential models were between 95 and 156 times more energy efficient than the spiking model.
156 times.
Yeah.
That is not a small difference. That is like choosing to commute in a fighter jet instead of on a bicycle. The brain would not tolerate that level of inefficiency unless it was absolutely unavoidable.
It just confirms that digital spikes are a last resort, reserved for when speed and reliability are so critical that they override every other consideration. It's the brain's emergency broadcast system.
And that profound inefficiency must also shape how the brain chooses to use those spikes.
It does. The models show that the most energy-efficient way to use spikes is to maximize the information per spike, not to just fire faster. The brain is strongly incentivized to pack as much meaning as possible into each one of those expensive, data-destroying pulses. Crocus. So we've laid out this case that the digital spike is fast and reliable, but it's also incredibly wasteful and information poor. And that high cost, it sort of forces you to take a step back and ask if we're even thinking about this the right way.
You mean if it's such a bad way to code data, maybe the brain isn't coding data in the way we think of it, like a computer.
Exactly. You're challenging that whole traditional metaphor. The idea of rate coding or temporal coding, it assumes the brain is using these complex algorithms to decode patterns of spikes. But that seems like a really complicated solution for an ancient system to evolve.
It adds a layer of abstraction that maybe isn't there.
It does. Why would a primitive organism need this incredibly complex decoding machinery just to, say, move away from something painful?
Yeah.
And the metaphor breaks down when you look at simple mechanical systems.
Like the heart's pacemaker.
Right. The pacemaker sells fire action potentials, and that firing is the command that makes the heart beat. It doesn't encode information that the heart muscle then decodes. The firing is the direct mechanical cause.
Okay, so what's the alternative view? If the neuron isn't decoding, what is it doing?
The alternative is that it's simply mapping causality. This is the core idea behind the conditioned integration memory network, or CIMN logic.
CIMN.
The basic idea is that a neuron's natural function is just to integrate different causal inputs. The whole network isn't designed to process abstract data. It's designed to build a direct, physical model of the causal relationships it observes in the world.
So the nervous system is basically a causality simulator. How do the parts of the neuron map onto that idea?
It's a pretty direct mapping. The neuron itself just represents a thing, a memory, a condition. It could be apple, red, or Rin. The synapse is the causal link between two of those things, the potential for one to lead to another over time.
And I assume the strength of that link, the learning, is the synaptic weight.
Exactly. The synaptic weight is just the amount of causal power one neuron has over another, strengthened by repeated experience. When one thing consistently causes another, that synaptic weight gets stronger.
Okay, this completely changes the meaning of the firing rate. If it's not a 1 or a 0 in a code, what is a high firing rate in this CMN framework?
A high firing rate is a direct statement about the sufficiency of the conditions. It means all my required inputs are here, my conditions are met, and therefore I have strong causal power to influence the next event. A low firing rate means my conditions aren't met, so I am currently ineffective.
It's not a code to be read. It's a direct measure of how much causal influence that neuron has at that exact moment.
Precisely, and that aligns perfectly with what neurons actually do. They sum up all their inputs, and if the sum reaches a threshold, they fire.
Let's use an example, the idea of eating.
Okay, so the action, let's say eating, C, it only gets strongly activated if multiple conditions converge. For instance, you see a round object, A, you see green leaves, B. Neither round alone nor leaves alone is enough to make you want to eat it. But when the neuron representing eating gets strong input from both A and B at the same time, its conditions are met and it fires strongly.
That explains the all-or-nothing firing when conditions are met. But what about all the stuff that might happen? The gray areas, the possibilities? How does this model handle potential?
That's where the idea of information potentiality, or INP, comes in. This is represented by those continuous analog graded potentials, or just a very low firing rate. It's a state of pre-activation.
Okay, give me a real-world example of that.
Let's take a thunderstorm. You have a neuron that represents lightning. Right now, it's quiet. Then you look outside and see dark clouds. That condition alone isn't enough to make the lightning neuron fire strongly, but it might trigger a little graded potential or a very low rate of firing. That's the INP. It's a prediction that's not effective yet, but the potential is now physically present in the system.
It's humming at a low level.
It's humming. Then you hear the sound of distant thunder. Now you have two converging conditions, clouds and thunder. That combined input is finally sufficient. The firing rate of the lightning neuron spikes, and it becomes an effective representation that can now cause other things to happen, like you deciding to go inside.
So potentiality is always there, physically vibrating in the network.
Yeah.
But it only gains causal power when enough evidence accumulates.
Exactly. And this same logic works for memories, for thoughts, and critically, for motor movements. Let's use the traffic light example.
Oh.
You're sitting at a red light. The motor neurons for pressing the accelerator are not silent. They're firing at a very low preparatory rate. That's the IMP for going. The condition is waiting.
Okay.
When the light turns amber, the condition for going becomes more sufficient, and that preparatory firing rate increases a little bit. Then the light turns green, the condition is now fully sufficient, the firing rate spikes, and the movement is executed.
That perfectly explains the preparatory firing that scientists see in the motor cortex before someone even decides to move. It's not the brain thinking about it, it's the brain physically representing the growing sufficiency of the conditions for that action.
And this makes the system incredibly flexible. It's a closed-loop controller. If a dog runs into the street, the conditions change instantly. That changes the firing rates, and your motor plan is adjusted on the fly without having to stop and run some complex decoding algorithm from scratch.
The network is just this direct, continuous, causal map of the world, and it's always vibrating with every possibility. The only thing that matters is whether the conditions are sufficient to cross the threshold and have an effect.
Right. And what's really amazing is that when you build computer models of this, the CIMN can actually predict how a sequence of events will unfold faster than it happens in real time.
It generates foresight.
It generates foresight as a natural consequence of its structure. It automatically tells you not just what's most likely to happen next, the things with high firing rates, but also all the less likely possibilities, the INPs, that are just waiting for one more piece of evidence to become effective. It's a system that is fundamentally built for prediction and readiness.
This has been a really profound journey, all the way from the tiniest molecular pumps up to these huge ideas about what cognition even is.
We really did cover the whole stack. We started with that incredible metabolic cost, the sodium-potassium pump burning a third of our energy just to keep the system negative and ready.
Just to maintain potential.
Then we dissected the action potential itself, that all-or-nothing digital spike. It's what gives us speed over distance, and it explains things like the difference between feeling an impact and feeling the pain that follows.
But we saw the huge cost of that speed. That digital spike is, well, it's wasteful, up to 156 times less energy efficient than an analog signal, and it throws away a huge amount of information.
The very act of creating the spike degrades the quality of the signal. And that inefficiency, that paradox, is what pushed us to look at a new framework.
Right, moving away from the computer metaphor of neural coding and toward this idea of the condition integration memory network.
Where the neuron isn't decoding data, it's just building a direct, dynamic, causal map of the world. And the firing rate is simply a measure of how sufficient the conditions are for the next thing to happen.
The one thread that really ties all of this together is that the entire system, from the pump to the spike to the logic, it's all optimized for one thing: vigilance.
For immediate adaptive response, yes.
It really changes how you think about the cost of just being aware.
It does. The very speed of human thought and reaction is not achieved through effortless power, but through a constant, relentless, and metabolically expensive effort to stay precisely balanced on the razor's edge of potential. A performance of biological vigilance that demands nearly a third of our daily energy, just so we can be ready for that single critical millisecond.